On stage, Weather Report operated as one of the most cohesive and innovative units in jazz fusion, possessing exceptional musical chemistry. However, behind the acclaimed performances, the internal dynamics were deeply strained. When their visionary bassist Jaco Pastorius began to unravel under the severe impacts of bipolar disorder and substance abuse, the band's rigorous touring commitments did not stop. Ultimately, as his condition worsened and his behavior became unmanageable, the band's leadership dismissed him and brought in a replacement to fulfill their commercial obligations. The group carried on with the tour, reflecting the stark reality of the music industry, a demanding enterprise that often pushes forward despite the profound personal tragedies of its creators. The groundwork for this tragedy was laid the moment the music industry dragged jazz out of intimate, smoky clubs and thrust it into massive, highly monetized arenas. As the 1970s bled into the 80s, record labels were nurturing unpredictable freeform artists. They demanded reliable industrial-scale touring entities. The market forced musicians to operate as a single highly profitable brand. When fans bought a ticket, they weren't just paying for a hit record. They were buying the stage chemistry, the interlocking rhythms, and the intoxicating illusion of a telepathic brotherhood. Weather Report was engineered to be the ultimate product of this machine, a band sold to the world as a unified family, even as the corporate structure inside was quietly crushing them. Weather Report was the absolute epitome of this collective magic. When you listen to them, you are not hearing a faceless backing band standing in the shadows of a lead star. Their power came entirely from the collective, the interaction between specific generational talents, creating an acoustic and electronic miracle where the absence of even one person would ruin the entire spell. But behind the curtain, the reality of maintaining that brand was a daily, grueling psychological war. The foundation of this war was built on a profoundly unequal power dynamic, a massive structural fault line that would eventually swallow the band whole. Weather Report was co-founded in late 1970 by two absolute legends of the genre, keyboardist Joe Zawinul and saxophonist Wayne Shorter. Shorter was a mystic, a quiet, deeply introspective genius who had been the primary compositional architect for Miles Davis's greatest quintet. He spoke through complex poetic phrasing and possessed a musical intellect that was revered across the globe. Zawinul, an Austrian immigrant and former amateur boxer who had played with Cannonball Adderley, was his absolute polar opposite. Zawinul was intensely driven, highly competitive, fiercely pragmatic, and hungry for commercial domination. In the beginning, it was billed as an equal partnership, an open canvas for jazz experimentation. But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the balance of power shifted entirely, revealing exactly who was the brains of the operation and who was the dominating force. Zawinul amassed a literal fortress of synthesizers on stage, a towering wall of electronics that allowed him to control the bass lines, the strings, the brass, and the entire sonic atmosphere. His personality soon mirrored his equipment. He became the undisputed dictator of Weather Report. He controlled the finances, he dictated the grueling rehearsal schedules, and he fiercely guarded the musical direction, ensuring that his vision was the only one that mattered. This dictatorial shift had a devastating, suffocating impact on the group's internal chemistry. Wayne Shorter, a man whose saxophone playing was once the guiding light of modern jazz, was effectively muzzled. He was relegated to the background, stripped of his creative agency, occasionally permitted to step forward to play a brief atmospheric solo over Zawinul's dense electronic soundscapes before retreating back into the shadows. Shorter became the marginalized figure in his own band. Observers, critics, and hardcore jazz aficionados often wondered why a man of Shorter's towering intellect and undeniable talent tolerated this marginalization. The answer lies in the insidious nature of the corporate band structure and the commercial machine. Weather Report had become a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar enterprise. Walking away meant forfeiting massive touring revenue, battling the label over severe contract breaches, and dismantling a brand he had spent over a decade building. The system inherently incentivized silence and compliance. Record labels and management sold Weather Report as a stable, unified brand, completely ignoring the fact that the internal relationships were quietly rotting. Shorter survived by emotionally detaching. He chose the path of least resistance to protect his livelihood, whilst the band fundamentally ceased to be a collaborative partnership. It became a Zawinul dictatorship, a commercial machine where the label forced the group to keep touring and maintain an image of solidarity, even as the founders grew entirely disconnected. But every dictatorship needs a spark to keep the masses entertained, a brilliant distraction to ensure the tickets keep selling. For Weather Report, that spark was a young man from Florida named Jaco Pastorius. When Jaco officially joined the band in 1976, he brazenly introduced himself to Zawinul as the greatest bass player in the world. Within a year, he had proven it to the entire planet. Jaco completely revolutionized the electric bass, physically ripping the metal frets off his instrument to create a singing, fluid, horn-like tone that redefined the rhythmic and melodic possibilities of modern music. Alongside the brilliant, steadying presence of young drummer Peter Erskine, this four-man lineup became the definitive golden era of Weather Report. They recorded the album Heavy Weather, which achieved massive commercial success driven by the global crossover hit Birdland. When this specific quartet stepped onto a stadium stage, the interplay was nothing short of an acoustic miracle. It was a perfectly balanced, albeit highly volatile, equation. Zawinul's dominating aggressive electronic structures, Shorter's enigmatic floating textures, Erskine's flawless timekeeping, and Jaco's explosive, entirely unpredictable genius. The audience was captivated by the sheer, undeniable magic of this collective. They bought the records and filled the arenas because they believed they were witnessing a group of men who were born to stand next to each other. However, the industry's demand to monetize that genius was relentless, cold, and entirely devoid of human empathy. The touring schedule was punishing. To Columbia Records, the booking agents, and Joe Zawinul himself, Weather Report was a commercial property that needed to be leveraged in every major city across the globe. They were locked into an endless, grinding cycle of recording, flying, and performing high-octane sets that drained them physically and mentally. The pressure to be perfect every single night, to maintain the illusion of the happy, boundary-pushing jazz family, was a suffocating weight. The more perfectly they played together on stage, the more the audience marveled at their synchronicity, completely unaware of the crushing endurance and profound isolation required behind the scenes. They were not allowed to be vulnerable artists. They were highly paid shift workers in a factory of their own making. The brand was exponentially more powerful than any individual within it. And in this suffocating, high-stakes environment, where any sign of weakness was viewed as a threat to the bottom line, the weakest link was destined to snap. The corporate machine had successfully trapped them in a gilded cage, and no one was about to crack under the pressure more violently or more publicly than Jaco Pastorius. The applause that washed over Weather Report during the early 1980s was deafening, a roar of commercial validation that drowned out the quiet, desperate fracturing happening in the dressing rooms. Joe Zawinul stood behind his fortress of keyboards, convinced that his iron grip was the sole reason for their triumph. Wayne Shorter stood in the shadows, his saxophone a silent witness to a brotherhood that had been compromised for capital, and Jaco Pastorius, the blazing comet who had propelled them into the stratosphere, was beginning to burn up on re-entry. The record executives looked at the four men on stage and saw only a flawless money-making machine, completely blind to the fact that the engine was rapidly overheating. The stage was set for one of the most brutal psychological collapses in the history of music, a collapse that the system would not seek to heal, but would merely seek to survive. The true cost of their magnificent chemistry was about to be exacted, and the bill would be paid entirely in blood. To the thousands of fans packing into arenas from Tokyo to Berlin in the early 1980s, the concerts were a masterclass in musical telepathy. When the lights dimmed and the synthesizer intro of Birdland washed over the crowd, Weather Report did not look like a group of men working a grueling corporate job. They looked like gods of sound. They sold the illusion of absolute unified brilliance. But the terrifying reality of the music industry is that it demands artists operate like industrial machinery, whilst completely ignoring the fragile biological reality of the human beings powering that machine. The relentless, unyielding pressure to maintain the Weather Report brand was about to collide violently with the fragile mental architecture of their brightest star. The victim would be Jaco Pastorius, but the true villain was the system that watched him drown and explicitly forbade anyone from throwing him a lifeline. To understand how a generational genius is allowed to disintegrate in plain sight, we must examine the specific toxic environment of a global jazz fusion tour during this era. By 1980, Weather Report was not merely playing music. They were executing high-wire acrobatics without a net. The compositions Joe Zawinul demanded were staggeringly complex, requiring a level of intense, sustained concentration that drained the musicians to their very marrow. They were locked into an endless cycle of airports, sterile hotel rooms, and deafening sound checks. For a healthy mind, this level of isolation and physical exhaustion is punishing. For a mind plagued by severe, undiagnosed mental illness, it is a death sentence. Jaco Pastorius was suffering from bipolar disorder. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the psychiatric understanding and public empathy for mental illness within the entertainment industry were practically non-existent. When Jaco experienced the manic phases of his illness, the industry initially mistook it for eccentric genius. His boundless energy, his ability to stay awake for days, writing intricate horn arrangements, and his wildly flamboyant stage persona were highly profitable traits. The record executives and concert promoters loved the mania because it sold tickets. They loved the wild, shirtless bass player who would backflip off his amplifiers. But mania is a pendulum, and when it swings back, the resulting depression is absolute, crushing, and physically debilitating. Trapped within the relentless machinery of the tour, unable to sleep, and terrified by the dark valleys of his own mind, Jaco turned to the only medicine the music industry readily supplied: alcohol and cocaine. In the ecosystem of 1980s touring, these substances were not just available, they were often facilitated by the environment as a brutal chemical means to keep the workers awake and performing. But for a man with bipolar disorder, cocaine is akin to pouring gasoline onto a house fire. It accelerated his mania to terrifying psychotic heights and deepened his depressions into catatonic despair. It is at this precise juncture that the absolute ruthlessness of the weather report ecosystem was exposed. In any humane profession, a colleague exhibiting clear signs of psychological collapse and severe substance abuse would be immediately pulled from the front line. The tour would be halted. The human being would be placed in medical care. But Weather Report was not a family. It was a multinational corporate asset. The financial architecture of a major tour is built on a terrifying concept known as tour debt. Columbia Records and the booking agencies fronted massive sums of money to secure arenas, hire lighting rigs, and transport tons of equipment across continents. If the band canceled a string of dates because their bass player was mentally ill, the insurance companies of the era would rarely pay out. The financial liability would fall squarely onto the shoulders of the band members and their management. The executives in the boardrooms looked at the spreadsheets and made a cold, calculated decision. A sick Jaco Pastorius, playing at 40% capacity, was still more profitable than a canceled tour. The system explicitly demanded that the breakdown be monetized. This corporate mandate was ruthlessly enforced by the band's internal dictator, Joe Zawinul. Zawinul was a man forged in the harsh realities of post-war Europe. He believed in iron discipline, punctuality, and an unrelenting work ethic. He viewed Jaco's escalating addiction and erratic behavior not as the tragic symptoms of a deadly disease, but as a personal insult. To Zawinul, it was gross insubordination. He lacked the empathy or the willingness to understand the biochemical warfare happening inside his bassist's brain. Instead of offering a hand to pull Jaco from the abyss, Zawinul tightened his grip on the band's repertoire, demanding rigid perfection and openly berating Jaco when he stumbled. The rehearsal rooms, once a sanctuary of collaborative magic, became tribunals of humiliation. For Wayne Shorter and drummer Peter Erskine, the daily reality of the Weather Report tour became an exercise in profound psychological torture. They were front-row witnesses to the destruction of their brother, yet they were contractually gagged and structurally powerless to stop it. This resonates deeply with anyone who has ever watched a loved one succumb to addiction or mental decay. The agonizing helplessness, the desperate desire to intervene, and the crushing realization that the machine will not stop grinding. Erskine, in particular, bore a heavy burden. As the drummer, he was the rhythmic anchor. Every night he had to try and lock in with a bass player who was increasingly disconnected from reality. The live performances, which fans paid premium prices to see, devolved into grotesque spectacles of suffering disguised as entertainment. Jaco began to sabotage the shows. Driven by chemically induced psychosis, he would wander away from his microphone, play wildly out of key, or paint his face in tribal patterns, staring blankly out into the darkness of the arenas. He would sometimes simply stop playing in the middle of a complex arrangement, leaving Erskine to frantically hold the groove together while Zawinul glared daggers from behind his synthesizer fortresses. This is the point where the magic of the collective became a mandated lie. While the crowds were mesmerized by the sonic perfection on stage, they remained blissfully ignorant that they were witnessing the slow-motion dismantling of a human soul for the sake of a ticket price. Shorter and Erskine were forced to grit their teeth, play their intricate parts, and project an image of musical solidarity, while the man standing 3 feet away from them was actively dying inside. They were forced to be complicit in the exploitation of their friend because the contract dictated that the music could not stop. The label demanded that the brand remain pristine. The dissonance between the soaring, beautiful melodies they were playing and the ugly, tragic reality of their daily existence was enough to shatter anyone's soul. Zawinul's response to the chaos was to further isolate Jaco. The bassist was increasingly frozen out of decision-making processes. His compositions were sidelined, and he was treated with open contempt by the band's leadership. The message was clear. You are a defective component in my machine, and you are only here because removing you right now would cost me money. It was a complete and total stripping of Jaco's human dignity. The man who had revitalized the band, who had brought them their greatest commercial triumphs, was now treated as a toxic liability that had to be managed until he could be safely discarded. The tragedy of this era of Weather Report is that the system worked exactly as it was designed to. The record label continued to sell albums. The promoters continued to sell out arenas in Japan, Europe, and America. The brand remained highly lucrative. The corporate structure proved that it could successfully absorb the mental collapse of a generational genius, mask it with bright stage lights, and turn his agony into a marketable commodity. They kept propping Jaco up, wiping the sweat from his face, strapping the bass around his neck, and shoving him out into the spotlight, night after bloody night. But a human being can only be treated as a shock absorber for so long before the chassis completely breaks. Jaco's behavior was becoming impossible to contain, and his playing, once the gold standard of the industry, was beginning to audibly deteriorate. The tolerance of the dictator was reaching its absolute limit. The ledger was being recalculated, and the executives were beginning to realize that the liability was finally outweighing the asset. The machine had almost finished extracting the marrow. It was nearly time to spit out the bones. When the lights went down in the empty arenas after another disastrous, tension-filled concert, the silence between the members of Weather Report was heavier than the amplifiers they dragged across the globe. There was no post-show camaraderie, no sharing of drinks to celebrate a flawless solo. There was only the quick, desperate retreat to separate hotel rooms. Wayne Shorter retreated into his quiet detachment, protecting his own sanity. Joe Zawinul retreated to his ledgers and his anger, calculating the cost of the night's mistakes. And Jaco Pastorius retreated into the dark, terrifying labyrinth of his own mind, accompanied only by the chemicals that were slowly killing him. The band that had once communicated so profoundly through their instruments had entirely lost the ability to speak to one another as human beings. The corporate mandate to keep smiling and keep playing had successfully murdered their friendship. The guillotine was raised, the blade was sharpened by breach of contract clauses, and the only question remaining was how brutally the execution would be carried out. The breaking point of a legendary band is rarely a cinematic explosion. It is usually a quiet, administrative execution. By 1982, the acoustic miracle of Weather Report had devolved into a daily high-stakes crisis management operation. Jaco Pastorius, the revolutionary bassist who had redefined the instrument and catapulted the band to global stadium status, was completely consumed by undiagnosed bipolar disorder and severe substance abuse. He was no longer a reliable corporate asset. He was a volatile liability threatening the profit margins of an international touring machine. And in the brutally pragmatic worldview of bandleader Joe Zawinul, liabilities were not to be rehabilitated. They were to be eliminated. The firing of Jaco Pastorius was not an intervention. It was an amputation conducted without anesthetic. There was no concerted effort from the record label to halt the tour, absorb the financial hit, and send their star into psychiatric care. The system did not view Jaco as a sick family member needing salvation. It viewed him as a defective component that was slowing down the assembly line. When his chemically induced psychosis made him entirely unpredictable on stage, missing cues, wandering aimlessly, or simply refusing to play the intricate arrangements, Zawinul made the cold, unilateral decision to cut him loose. He coldly kicked Jaco out onto the street, stripping him of his musical home, his primary income, and his last remaining tether to reality. This is where the true terrifying mechanics of the music industry's replacement machine are exposed. A band is often sold by record labels, management, and the market as a stable, unified brand, even when the human foundation inside has completely rotted away. The executives knew that the brand name Weather Report still held immense commercial power. The venues were booked, the tour advances were paid, and the financial apparatus demanded that the music must not stop. Therefore, the system forced the group to continue touring, release new albums, and maintain an ironclad image of solidarity, completely disregarding the exhaustion and emotional fractures of the actual human beings involved. To plug the gaping hole left by Jaco, Zawinul immediately recruited a young, incredibly talented bass player named Victor Bailey. It is crucial to state that Victor Bailey was not the villain in this tragedy. He was a brilliant musician, walking into an impossible, psychologically toxic situation. He was simply answering a casting call. But to Wayne Shorter and Peter Erskine, the swiftness of this replacement was a profound, sickening humiliation. Imagine the psychological torture inflicted upon the rhythm section. In jazz, the relationship between a drummer and a bassist is the most intimate connection on the stage. It is the absolute heartbeat of the collective. Peter Erskine had spent years locking in with Jaco's specific, unpredictable, explosive rhythmic phrasing. They had built a telepathic groove that defined the era's sound. Now, Erskine was forced to walk into a rehearsal room, sit behind his drum kit, and play those exact same intricate compositions with a total stranger. Muscle memory is a powerful, uncompromising force. Every time Erskine anticipated the specific guttural growl of Jaco's fretless bass, he was met with a different frequency, a different phrasing, a different human soul. It was a constant, jarring, auditory reminder of the brother they had abandoned. For Wayne Shorter, the indignity was equally severe. The saxophonist, already stripped of his leadership and marginalized by Zawinul's dictatorial control of the synthesizers, was now forced to witness the ultimate devaluation of their shared history. Shorter and Erskine had to grit their teeth, play the old familiar notes, and pretend that their musical family hadn't just been shattered. They were forced to engage in a grotesque pantomime of brotherhood. The live performances that followed were an exercise in mandated deception. When the newly reconstituted Weather Report stepped out onto festival stages, the audience cheered for the brand. The fans wanted the tight arrangements, the blistering solos, and the illusion of a collective genius. To deliver this, Shorter and Erskine were contractually and structurally coerced into lying. They had to fake smiles. They had to nod at the new bass player, projecting an aura of seamless transition and unbothered joy. They had to act as if the man who had helped them build this empire was not currently spiraling into a deadly abyss of homelessness and mental decay. This dynamic is exactly why older audiences, particularly women, find the breakdown of such legendary bands so deeply affecting. It perfectly mirrors the painful motifs of marriages, families, and friendships that are slowly eroded by external pressures. leaving behind people who are forced to keep up appearances while aging in isolation and grief. A highly synchronized group on stage often makes the audience wonder what kind of suffering they had to endure together behind closed doors. In Weather Report's case, the suffering was the complete subjugation of their loyalty to the demands of capitalism. The record label's PR machinery worked overtime to sanitize the transition. In interviews, Zawinul controlled the narrative, framing Jaco's departure as a necessary step for the band's evolution. The music press, eager for access to the jazz fusion titans, largely regurgitated the official line. The tragedy was swept under the rug of corporate momentum. Victor Bailey was paraded in photo shoots, hastily fitted into the visual aesthetic of the band, while the legacy of the man he replaced was actively minimized to protect the current product. This era of Weather Report lays bare the most chilling reality of the entertainment complex. It is a system that views artists not as irreplaceable creators, but as interchangeable hardware. If a part breaks, you do not mourn it. You swap it out and restart the engine. Zawinul's dictatorial grip ensured that the compositions took precedence over the human beings playing them. He believed that his written notes and synthesizer patches were the true genius of Weather Report, and that the musicians were merely vessels hired to execute his vision. By discarding Jaco and instantly replacing him, Zawinul and the label proved that the profound magical chemistry the fans worshipped was considered entirely disposable by the men balancing the checkbooks. The humiliation for the survivors was absolute. Every night they bowed to the roaring crowds. They knew the truth. They knew that their brotherhood had been sold out. They knew that the magic of the collective was a marketing slogan used to obscure a toxic ecosystem of power and exploitation. They were no longer a band. They were highly skilled, well-compensated shift workers in the Joe Zawinul franchise, playing the soundtrack to their own moral defeat. When the tour bus rolled out of the arena parking lots, leaving the echoing applause behind, the silence between the remaining members of Weather Report was suffocating. They had successfully pulled off the illusion. The fans had accepted the new lineup. The promoters were happy. The label executives were counting the receipts, and the threat of financial ruin had been averted. But as Wayne Shorter stared out the window into the dark passing landscape, the true cost of their survival was undeniable. They had protected the brand, but they had lost their souls. They were now prisoners of their own legacy, condemned to play the hits of a broken family, fully aware that if any of them ever stumbled, the machine would not hesitate to replace them, too. The corporate beast had been fed, but out there in the dark, miles away from the stage lights, the ghost of Jaco Pastorius was beginning his terrifying descent into the abyss, abandoned by the very people he had made kings. While the newly reconstituted Weather Report continued to crisscross the globe in the early 1980s, playing to sold-out arenas and maintaining the highly profitable illusion of an unbroken musical family, a parallel, horrifying reality was unfolding in the shadows. The corporate machine had successfully performed its ruthless amputation. Joe Zawinul had secured his absolute dictatorship. The record label had protected its touring revenue, and the brand was safe. But the discarded limb, the generational genius known as Jaco Pastorius, was left to bleed out on the pavement. The descent of Jaco Pastorius is not merely a tragic rock and roll cliché of excess. It is a damning indictment of an entertainment complex that views human beings as disposable hardware. When Jaco was fired from Weather Report, he was not just stripped of his job. He was stripped of his primary support structure, his daily routine, and the intense, focused environment that had, for a time, channeled his manic energy into musical brilliance. Without the band, and without any intervention from the executives who had grown incredibly wealthy off his compositions, his undiagnosed bipolar disorder took absolute control. The pendulum of his illness swung violently into a permanent, terrifying mania, heavily fueled by alcohol and street drugs. The man who had revolutionized the electric bass, who had stood on the world's biggest stages and commanded the awe of millions, was suddenly wandering the streets of New York City's Greenwich Village as a homeless vagrant. He would sleep in parks. He would engage in erratic, aggressive arguments with strangers. He was a ghost haunting the very jazz clubs where he had once been treated as royalty. He would frequently attempt to jump on stage with amateur bands, his mind fractured, his playing a chaotic, heartbreaking shadow of its former glory. Where was the safety net? This is the question that haunts the legacy of the 1980s music industry. The executives at Columbia Records, who had happily collected the massive royalties from albums like Heavy Weather and Black Market, did not establish a fund for his psychiatric care. They did not send teams to pull him off the streets. The promoters, who had built their summer festival lineups around his star power, looked the other way. In the cold, unyielding logic of the corporate music business, an artist is only valuable as long as they are actively generating capital. The moment Jaco's illness rendered him incapable of completing a tour, his value dropped to zero. He was no longer a legendary musician. He was a liability that had been successfully excised from the spreadsheet. The system had squeezed the absolute maximum amount of profit from his brilliant, fragile mind. And when there was nothing left but illness and addiction, they threw the empty husk into the gutter. To add the ultimate sickening insult to injury, Jaco's prized instrument, the legendary 1962 Fender Jazz bass he had lovingly named the Bass of Doom, the very instrument that had recorded the tracks currently making the label millions, was stolen from him while he was sleeping on a park bench. He was entirely stripped of his identity. Meanwhile, inside the heavily guarded fortress of Weather Report, the atmosphere was suffocating. The band continued to record albums like Procession and Domino Theory, and they continued to tour. But the acoustic miracle was dead. What remained was a highly proficient, completely sterile cover band of Joe Zawinul's ego. Wayne Shorter, the quiet, mystical co-founder, was enduring a profound psychological crisis of his own. He was forced to step onto stage every night playing the arrangements he had helped build, knowing that the brother who had brought those arrangements to life was currently starving in an alleyway. For audiences, particularly older fans who understand the agonizing, slow death of a long-term partnership, Wayne Shorter's ultimate departure is the crucial emotional pivot of this era. Shorter had endured over a decade of Zawinul's dictatorial control. He had watched his own compositional voice be systematically suppressed, buried beneath layers of aggressive synthesizers. He had chosen the path of least resistance to protect his income and the brand. He had swallowed his pride, and he had swallowed the humiliation of watching Jaco be replaced. But the complete lack of humanity exhibited by the machine finally broke his compliance. Shorter realized that the family they had sold to the world was a complete fabrication. There was no loyalty. There was no brotherhood. There was only Joe Zawinul's relentless ambition and the record label's insatiable greed. The band was no longer an artistic collective. It was a hostile work environment where silence was demanded and dissent was punished. In late 1985, as the band prepared to record what would become their final studio album, This Is This, Shorter made his move. He did not explode in a dramatic confrontation. He simply withdrew his spirit. He contributed almost nothing to the writing process. He played his required parts with a cold, detached professionalism, fulfilling the absolute bare minimum of his contractual obligations. And then he walked away. Wayne Shorter's departure was the final, fatal blow to Weather Report. Zawinul, despite all his bravado and synthesizer power, knew that the brand could not survive the loss of both its defining instrumentalists. You can replace a bass player and force the audience to accept it, but you cannot replace the co-founder and the soul of the horn section without entirely shattering the illusion. The corporate entity finally ran out of its foundational credibility. In 1986, Weather Report quietly dissolved. There was no grand farewell tour. There was no emotional final bow. The machine simply ground to a halt because the last remaining human element had finally refused to participate in the charade. Shorter's escape was an act of profound self-preservation. He went on to reclaim his artistic voice, forming his own quartets and securing his legacy as a titan of composition, free from the dictatorial grip of his former partner. But his survival stood in stark, horrific contrast to the fate of the man they had left behind. By 1987, Jaco Pastorius had migrated back to his home state of Florida, but the change of scenery did not halt his terrifying downward spiral. He was completely unmoored from reality, banned from local venues, due to his aggressive, unpredictable behavior. The music industry had completely forgotten him. The world moved on to new sounds and new brands. He was 35 years old, a forgotten pioneer, living a nightmare of homelessness and psychosis. The tragedy reached its absolute blood-soaked climax on the night of September 11th, 1987, in Fort Lauderdale. Jaco, highly agitated and desperate for the stage, attempted to force his way into the Midnight Bottle Club after sneaking on stage at a Carlos Santana concert earlier in the evening and being ejected. The club's bouncer, a black belt in karate named Luke Havan, confronted him with a level of violence that far exceeded any notion of security. What happened next was not an argument, it was a slaughter. Jaco was beaten with such savage, unrestrained violence that his skull was fractured, his facial bones were shattered, and he suffered massive brain hemorrhaging. The man who had possessed the most famous articulate hands in jazz was left bleeding out on the concrete, unrecognizable. He was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. For 10 agonizing days, he lay in a coma. The news rippled through the music industry, reaching the executives in their corner offices and the former bandmates in their comfortable homes. The shock was profound, but the hypocrisy was deafening. The very system that had relentlessly squeezed the life out of him, the system that had prioritized a tour schedule over his mental health, was now forced to look at the horrifying physical manifestation of their neglect. On September 21st, 1987, Jaco Pastorius died. His death was the brutal, undeniable receipt for the magic of Weather Report. It proved that the flawless harmonies and the staggering stadium performances were not born of a joyful collective. They were extracted from a fragile human being who was systematically destroyed in the process. The record label released statements of mourning. Tributes were paid, but no amount of retrospective praise could wash the blood from the legacy. The brand had survived, the profits had been secured, but the cost was a human life, beaten to death outside a cheap club, abandoned by the very industry he had enriched. The aftermath of Jaco Pastorius' death in 1987 forced a reckoning within the jazz community. Publicly, the music industry mourned the loss, often leaning into the romanticized trope of the tortured genius. However, this narrative frequently glossed over the harsh realities of his unmanaged bipolar disorder, substance abuse, and the grueling pressures of the commercial touring circuit that exacerbated his decline. For the surviving leaders of Weather Report, the subsequent years diverged significantly. Joe Zawinul maintained his highly structured, uncompromising approach to music by forming the Zawinul Syndicate. He continued to dominate the fusion scene with complex, synthesizer-driven compositions and strict professional discipline until his death from cancer in 2007. Conversely, Wayne Shorter, who passed away in 2023, took a markedly different path. Moving away from the heavily sequenced electronic sound of late-era Weather Report, Shorter formed an acoustic quartet celebrated for its democratic, fluid, and empathetic improvisation. Deeply influenced by his Buddhist practice, Shorter's later career stood as a stark contrast to the rigid commercial mandates of his 1980s stadium tours. Former members like drummer Peter Erskine went on to have highly respected careers, though they carried the complex dual legacy of Weather Report, the undeniable pride of creating groundbreaking music, intertwined with the difficult memories of witnessing a brilliant bandmate's tragic deterioration. Today, Weather Report's discography is firmly cemented in music history. While conservatories worldwide study their unprecedented collective virtuosity, the band's story remains a sobering cautionary tale. It highlights the profound tension between artistic brilliance, human vulnerability, and the uncompromising machinery of the music business.